glad you're here for section 2 covering italic calligraphy. In this section, we're going to cover lowercase and numbers. In the last session, we covered tools, how to hold your pen, making your own line guide, and warm-ups. So we'll start with those warm-ups. Based on the way you label the lines from part 1, the lowercase letters take place mainly between the waistline and the baseline, with ascenders starting from the cap line and descenders going to the drop line. When you begin to write words and sentences, ascenders will hit above the cap line. The 10 to 15 degree slanted lines are spaced 1 inch apart to allow for practice with and without these lines. We will proceed through the lowercase letters in 10 groups that are based on the way the letters are formed. We will start with the A, D, G, Q group. Remember to go nice and slow. The way the lines terminate reflect the 45-degree angle you established earlier. Warm-ups are a fun time to experiment with decorations and embellishments for future projects. I mentioned in the first session that these squiggly lines are wonderful hyphens, and strung together in this way can be used to create borders or other embellishments for future projects. This is also a great time to work on your slant. These vertical lines mimic the stems, ascenders, and descenders that will be in the letters you will form. I also like to include these M and N strokes in my warm-ups. These letters are formed in one stroke. Also included in the warm-ups are these two-stroked O's, established by the 20th century calligrapher Edward Johnston. Most of the letters we will be forming take more than one stroke. We've established our 45-degree angle and are starting our A at the waistline, running parallel and swooping down to the baseline, back up to the waistline. Then starting stroke 2 at the waistline, going down to the baseline, flick your wrist. Remember to go nice and slow because you want those strokes to line up nicely. Notice that the first stroke goes all the way from the waist to the base and back up again. Let's do that again. Running parallel with the waistline for a little bit, curving down to the baseline and back up to the waist, making a raindrop shape. Then stroke 2, from the waist to the base, flick your wrist. I'll draw out those strokes. Stroke 1, from the waist, curving down to the base, back up to the waist again for stroke 1. And notice the A is taking place between the waistline and the baseline. And that all the strokes are meeting up nicely. Go nice and slow. So we're going to start at the waist, our first stroke, and we're going down to the baseline. Flick your wrist for stroke 2. And keep in mind the direction of the stroke affects the thick and thin. Now we will move on to the letter D. The bowl of the D starts out the same way as the lowercase a, running parallel with the waist for a bit, curving down to the baseline, then all the way back up to the waistline. But the ascender is going to start at the cap line. Then we're going to use this slanted line here and run the ascender down to our first stroke. Flick your wrist for stroke 2. Then stroke 3, we're going to put a cursive serif on top of our ascender. Let's do that again. Get a little bit more ink. We're going to run parallel with the waistline, swoop down to the base, right back up, then from the cap line down to the baseline, flick your wrist, then the cursive serif. And we're going to draw out the strokes again. Stroke 1, similar to the first stroke of your lowercase a. Then stroke 2, from the cap down to the base, flick your wrist. Stroke 3, cursive serif. Now let's move on to the letter G, which has a descender. So we're going down to the drop line. We're starting out the bowl in the same way as the A and the D, running parallel with the waistline, swooping down to the base, then back up to the waist again. Then, from the first stroke, start that second stroke at the waist, down to the drop. Then our third stroke, come in and meet your second stroke. We're going to do that again. Waist to base, back to the waist. From the waist down to the drop. Then go in and meet your second stroke. Put that tail on the descender there. And the descender is curving, and you can modify how you put the tail on your descender. Let's draw out the strokes. Stroke 1, from waist to base, back to the waist. Then stroke 2, from the waist down to the drop. Stroke 3, meet your second stroke for a tail on your descender. That's a little straight, but you can always modify the letters as you'd like in the way that's aesthetically pleasing to you. Now we'll go on to the Q. Again, starting out the bowl of the letter in the same way as the A, D, and G, running parallel with the waist for a bit, swooping down to the base, back up to the waist, then going down to the drop, and flick your wrist. 2 strokes. There's the bowl, and that teardrop shape, and then the descender coming from the waist down to the drop. Flick your wrist. And we'll do that again. Running parallel with the waist for a bit, swooping down to the base, back up to the waist, from the waist down to the drop, flick your wrist. Now let's do the strokes. Stroke 1, waist to base, back to the waist. Stroke 2, from the waist down to the drop, flick your wrist. Now on to the next group, the BP group. And as we start new groups, we can go ahead and reestablish our 45-degree angle if you like. Now the B has a ascender on it, so we're going to start at the cap line this time and swoop on down to the baseline and then come up a little bit. Then we're going to start between the waist and the base, then fan up and out to the waist, then back down to meet our first stroke. A little extra ink there. It's always good to keep a scratch pad. We'll put the Corsiva serif on the top for stroke 3. We'll do that again. Stroke 1 from cap to baseline, then up a little, from the middle up to the waist, back to meet your first stroke. Stroke 3, Corsiva serif. Now let's write out the strokes. Stroke 1 from the cap line to the base, then up a little. Stroke 2, coming around to meet the first part of your stroke. Notice that clam-like motion, those strokes coming to meet each other. Notice that direction to create those thicks and thins. Then stroke 3, the Corsiva serif. Now the P, go up to the waist a little bit, then down to the drop line. Then start midway between the waist and the base. Swoop up and fan out towards the waist, curving down to the base for stroke 2. Then stroke 3, go in and meet your second stroke. Let's do that again. A little serif below the waist, up to the waist, down to the drop line for a descender, then up to the waist, swooping down to the base, then meet your second stroke with that third stroke. The strokes here, up, down to the drop, stroke 1, stroke 2, waist to base, stroke 3, a little above the base, meet that second stroke. Let's go on to the CEO group. We can reestablish our 45-degree angle again. So we're going to start at the waist and curve down to the base, then back up a little. Then stroke 2, we're going to cap off our C. Then let's do it again. From the waist, curving down to the base. Stroke 2, cap off our C. And notice you can use the slanted line to act like an axis that's going through the spine of the C. Stroke 1, waist to base. Stroke 2, cap off our C. And again, these strokes are going away from each other like a clam. C for clam. And notice again, there's thin there. Go nice and slow to have those strokes meet up and create that thick and thin. This paper is a little rough, so I'm having a little bit of feathering, but you can see it here regardless. Let's go on to the E. Starting the same way. Waist curving down to the base, then up a little. Then stroke 2, just swoop on in, continuing to your first stroke. Let's do it again. Stroke 1, curving down to the base. Stroke 2, swooping in to your first stroke. Let's write those out. Stroke 1, waist to base. Stroke 2, swooping in. Let's go on to the O, the Edward Johnston O. Stroke 1, same way as the C and the E. Waist curving down to the base, then back up a little. Then stroke 2, just continue on and meet your first stroke. Let's do it again. Stroke 1, stroke 2. Write the strokes. Stroke 1, stroke 2. We've done the first 3 groups. Now to the FT group. We're going to start this line in between the cap line and the waistline. We're going to call it the T and F line. So we're going to take the ascender down through those lines down to the drop. Then for stroke 2, put a little tail on our descender. Stroke 3, we're going to cap off the ascender of our F. Stroke 4, crossbar at the waistline. Then let's do that again for this long letter. Start the ascender at the T and F line, going on down to the drop line. Then coming in with our second stroke to meet our first stroke. Stroke 3, going to cap off our F. Stroke 4, crossbar on our F. Let's write those out. Stroke 1, T and F line, down to the drop line. Stroke 2, go in and meet your first stroke. Stroke 3, I'll get course of a cap off of our F. Stroke 4, crossbar at the waistline. Now let's go on to the T. And I'll note here, when you're writing your T's, you want to go ahead and wait until you're finished writing the full word before you crossbar your T. You can also do that with your F's if you like. But we're going to start at the T and F line, go on down, back up a little bit at the baseline. Then we're going to crossbar at the waistline. Let's do that again. Stroke 1 from T and F line down to the baseline, crossbar at the waistline. Now let's draw out the strokes. From the T and F line down to the base, flick your wrist. Stroke 1. Stroke 2, crossbar at the waistline. Now let's go on to the H, K, and L group. We'll reestablish our 45-degree angle. And like we did with the B, we're going to start at the cap line, go on down to the baseline, then starting halfway between the waist and the base and fanning out towards the waist, then down to the base, flick your wrist. For stroke 2, stroke 3, course of a serif. Let's do that again. From the cap line down to the baseline, then curving up, down to the baseline, flick your wrist, course of a serif for stroke 3. We'll write out those strokes. Stroke 1, cap to base. Stroke 2, up to the waist, down to the base, flick your wrist. Stroke 3, course of a serif. Now let's go on to the lowercase k. So starting at the cap line, using those great 10 to 15 degree slanted lines, down to the base, then at the waist, dip in midway, then kick out to the base, flick your wrist. Stroke 3, make your course of a serif. K's are fun. Let's do that again. From the cap line down to the base. From the waist, dip in, then kick out to the base, flick your wrist, then stroke 3, course of a serif. Draw out the strokes. Stroke 1, cap to base. Stroke 2, dip in to kick out at the base. Stroke 3, course of a serif. Now let's move on to the lowercase L. Again, these great descenders, or ascenders, excuse me, are great to emphasize that 10 to 15 degree slant. Cap to base, flick your wrist, then stroke 2, course of a serif. Let's do it again. Cap to baseline, flick your wrist, stroke 2, course of a serif. Let's draw those out. Stroke 1, cap to baseline, flick your wrist, stroke 2, course of a serif. Now let's go on to the I and J group. Again, it's a time to talk about dotting your I and crossing your T when you're finished writing the whole word. Helps with spacing, and then also traditionally in cursive, you don't lift your pen as much. But there's stroke 1, then stroke 2. Well, let's do that again. Stroke 1, starting a little below the waist, going up to the waist, down to the base, flick your wrist. Stroke 2, downward motion at the T and F line. Stroke 1, waist to base, flick your wrist. Stroke 2, we're going to do downward motion at the T and F line and make that nice diamond shape. Okay, let's go on to the J. You can also wait to dot your J's as well. So a little below the waist, up to the waist, down to the drop line with the descender. Then stroke 2, go in and meet your first stroke. Stroke 3, dot your J with the downward stroke at the T and F line. Again, up to the waist, down to the drop, that 10 to 15 degree slant. Stroke 2, meet your first stroke. Stroke 3, downward motion at the T and F line to make that diamond shape again. 1, 2, 3. Gotten about halfway through now. So we're going to go on to the M, N, and R group now. Reestablishing our 45-degree angle. And these letters take place in one stroke. Starting a little below the waistline, going up to the waist, down to the base. Back up to the waist, down to the base. Up to the waist, down to the base. Flick your wrist. Let's do that again. One stroke. A little below the waist, up to the waist, down to the base. Up to the waist, down to the base. Up to the waist, down to the base. Flick your wrist. We'll see it's happening here between the waist and the baseline. We'll draw out the stroke. A little below the waist, up, down to the base, up to the waist, down to the base, up to the waist, down to the base, flick your wrist. And yeah, just take your time and be careful about where your humps start to fan out. We'll go on to the N. Starts the same way, except one hump, up to the waist, down to the base, up to the waist, down to the base, flick your wrist. One stroke. Again, up to the waist, down to the base, up to the waist, down to the base, flick your wrist. One stroke. Let's write that out. Up to the waist, down to the base, up to the waist, down to the base, up, one stroke. Now let's go on to the R. Half a hump instead of one. Up to the waist, down to the base, up to the waist, then down a little. Again, be careful about where you start to fan out. Notice here, I probably could have fanned out a little bit later. You don't want it to look like a V, but it's fine for right now. Up to the waist, down to the base. Up to the waist and down a little. That's better. And we'll go on to the strokes. Down, up to the waist, down a little. One stroke. Now we'll go on to the U and the Y group. Again, we can take this opportunity to reestablish our 45-degree angle if wanted or necessary. You can do the U as you would an upside down N by doing it in one stroke. So you go up to the waist, down to the base, all the way back up to the waist, down to the base, then flick your wrist. We can do that again. We can draw out that one stroke. Again, it's similar to an upside down N. Up to the waist, down to the base, then all the way back up to the waist. From the waist down to the base. Flick your wrist. One stroke. Now, I'll go ahead and show you the two-stroke U just in case. So we'll start out the same way. We'll go a little up to the waist, then down to the base, then stop about halfway, then go from the waist down to the base, flick your wrist. Notice that it does change the appearance of the U slightly when you do it in two strokes. Now we'll move on to the Y. Up to the waist, down to the base, up to the waist, then stroke 2, from the waist down to the drop line. Then stroke 3, go in and meet your second stroke. Do that again, up to the waist, down to the base, up to the waist. Stroke 2, from the waist to the drop. Stroke 3, go in and meet your second stroke. We'll draw out those strokes. Stroke 1, waist to base, up to the waist. Stroke 2, waist to drop. Stroke 3, meet your second stroke. Now we will move on to the V and W group. So we'll reestablish our 45-degree angle again. Finish off our last two groups. So the V, start a little below the waist again, then go almost straight up and down with that 10-degree slant. Then stroke 2, that heart-like shape meeting your first stroke. Stroke 1, waist to base. Stroke 2, meet your first stroke. Draw that out again. Stroke 1, waist to base. Stroke 2, waist swooping into the base, meeting your first stroke. Then we'll go on to the W, all down strokes, a little below the waist, up to the waist, down to the base. Stroke 2, waist to base, meet your first stroke. Stroke 3, waist to base. Stroke 4, half heart shape, meet your third stroke. Again, waist to base 1, waist to base 2, waist to base 3, heart shape, meet that third stroke. Notice your first and third strokes are at that 10 to 15 degree slant to help you slant your W. So stroke 1, stroke 2, stroke 3, stroke 4. All right, just one more group. We're going on to the S, X, Z group. Now these are kind of the misfits of the lowercase. They are together because they don't go with the others. So we'll start with the S. We'll snake our way down from the waist down to the base. Stroke 1, stroke 2, cap off the bottom, meet your first stroke. Stroke 3, cap off the top. And again, we're having those motions going away from each other. Stroke 1, snaking from the waist down to the base. And you can think of this as an axis going through the S to help you slant it. Then cap off the tops and the bottoms. Stroke 1, snaking down waist to base. Stroke 2, cap. Stroke 3, cap the top. And we'll go on to the X. Sometimes I wait to cross my X at the end of words as well. So we'll start with stroke 1, snaking down along that 10 to 15 degree slant. Then stroke 2, you're going to cross your first stroke. We'll do that again. Stroke 1, along that 10 to 15 degree slant. Stroke 2, cross your first stroke. We'll write it out. Stroke 1, waist to base, flick your wrist. Stroke 2, across your first stroke. Now we'll go on to Z. So you're going to wave across the waistline, then loop without making a loop, cross on down to the base, loop without making a loop along the base. One stroke. Do that again. Wave along the waistline, loop without making a loop, down to the baseline, loop without making a loop, across the base. One stroke. We'll draw that out. Wave across the waist, loop down to the base, loop without making a loop, along the base. One stroke. All right. We've finished the lowercase, so now we will move on. Okay, now on to the numbers. We'll reestablish our 45-degree angle. And the numbers are mainly going to take place between the waistline and the baseline. It's nice for them to be around the same height as the lowercase numbers. So up to the waist, down to the base, one stroke for the number 1. Again, up to the waist, down to the base, one stroke for the number 1. Let's draw that out. Up to the waist, down to the base, one stroke. Let's go on to the number 2. You can start below the waist, then curve up and around down to the base, then loop without making a loop across the base, one stroke. Again, curve around from the waist down to the base, loop without making a loop, one stroke. And with this round number, you can use that 10 to 15 degree slant as an axis again. One stroke, loop without making a loop at the base, one stroke. Let's move on to the number 3. The top counter's a little bit smaller than the bottom. One stroke, dip in, then keep on going down to the base. And you could stop there, or you could add the second stroke to complete your 3. And we'll do that again. 2 strokes, a little below the waist, curve up, dip in, go on down to the base, stroke 2, complete your 3. Stroke 1, dip in, down to the base, stroke 2, meet your first stroke. Let's go on to number 4. 2 strokes as well. Start at the waist, make an L with a loop without making a loop, cross over, And then let's make that stem on that 10 to 15 degree slanted line for the stem of our 4. Let's do it again. Waist down to between the waist and base, then stem a little below the waist down to that baseline. 2 strokes. Stroke 1 and stroke 2. Okay, we'll go on to the number 5. 3 strokes down to make a counter. Stroke 1, stroke 2, cap off our first stroke. Stroke 3, crossbar our first stroke. Stroke 1, waist to base. Stroke 2, meet your first stroke. Stroke 3, crossbar your first stroke. And we'll draw those out. And the stem here will help you slant your 5. Stroke 1, and curving around down to the base. Then stroke 2, you go in and meet that first stroke. Then stroke 3, crossbar on your first stroke. Let's go on to the 6. You're going to start out from the waist, making a C-like motion, using this line as an axis again. From the waist, curving down to the base and up a little. Then starting about a third of the way up, going up and over, meeting your first stroke. You can add this third optional stroke if you like. We'll do that again. Stroke 1, waist to base. Stroke 2, up and over, nice and round. Stroke 3, cap off your 6. Now remember, you're using that 10 to 15 degree slant as an axis on your 6. You also want to go nice and slow to keep all of your strokes meeting up nicely. And the 6 can be kind of challenging, so just keep the bowl nice and round. And like I said before, if you want to leave that serif off the 6, you can do so. But let's write out the strokes. Stroke 1, waist to base. Stroke 2, stroke 3. Now let's go on to the number 7, and that's 1 stroke. Starting a little below the waist, then go up, kind of parallel with the waist, and curving down to the base. 1 stroke. Up to the waist, over, curving down to the base. 1 stroke. Let's do it again. Up, over, down. 1 stroke. Then we'll go on to the 8. Again, you can use this as an axis. This is a round number. 1 stroke, snaking down from the waist to the base, curving back up, just this side of the first part of your stroke. Let's do it again. Snaking down, waist to base, curving up, 1 stroke. I'll write that out. Snaking down from the waist to the base, then curving up to the side of your first part of your stroke. 1 stroke. You can also do the 8 where it looks kind of like a little snowman and 2 circles stacked one on top of the other. So we're going to do stroke 1, stroke 2, stroke 3, stroke 4. So the top bowl is large or smaller, than the bottom bowl. We'll do that again. Stroke 1, stroke 2, stroke 3, stroke 4. Nice and slow so those strokes meet up nicely. Stroke 1, stroke 2, stroke 3, stroke 4. All right, we just have 2 numbers left. You can see how these numbers were formed. So we're reestablishing that 45-degree angle. And then for the 9, we're going to start with the bowl first. So we're going to start at the waist. Then we're going to curve down between the waist and the base in a C motion, but nice and round. Then curving down from the waist to the base. Stroke 2, then stroke 3, meet your second stroke. We'll do that again. Curving down the bowl of your 9. Stroke 2, waist to base. Stroke 3, cap off your 9. We'll write those out. Stroke 1, stroke 2, and stroke 3. Now we'll go on to the zeros, which are very similar to the O's, except they're going to be more narrow. Stroke 1, stroke 2. Stroke 1, stroke 2. I'll write those again. Stroke 1, stroke 2. That is going to complete our numbers. Now we can move on to part 3. Please visit my website and share your progress on Instagram and/or Facebook. Thank you.